Hello, everyone. I'm Nate Truex, and you're listening to the Croccast Podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Croccast Podcast. I'm your host, Nate, and today I'm joined by Professor Rachel Pikstein, the founder, director, and research mentor at Pikstein Labs. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So you want to get started on how you first got into herps and kind of your career path up to this point?
So I very much so have a unconventional path, but I think like a lot of herpers, it started very young. I've been told so much in academics, nobody cares what you did as a kid, but you know what? Forget that. Everybody cares when you study conservation and ecology and reptiles, and we want to hear about the first. So I was 4 years old. I had bunnies and guinea pigs and cats and dogs, and I turned to my parents and said, I want something that is not fuzzy. And they had the sense to buy me a native Michigan ribbon snake. And I tell people, I go, I was obsessed ever since that first snake. There was no turning back. It was instant love at first sight. Even prior to that, very dinosaur obsessed as a child. But I mean, after that, once I realized they lived in my backyard, I was catching, earthworms and earwigs, and then it was toads, and then it was garter snakes, and then it was, really, difficult catching of, more difficult water-based snakes, turtles, frogs. And then, kind of followed the traditional path. I went to to an extent, I went to a local college, stayed home, saved money, transferred to Michigan State, and where I was lucky enough to do herpetology. They actually had an elective, and it was in our zoology curriculum, zoo and aquarium science, and it was with Professor Jim Harding, who is one of the greatest North American experts on turtles. He's like the world expert on the North American wood turtle. And just, having labs where you're digging up turtle nests and all that, and knew I loved it, took mammalogy, ichthyology, all that, entomology, love my bugs. But unfortunately, you keep getting told that there's no career, there's no real herpetology degree. I'm bad at math. And so I actually ended up switching and double majoring in communications just to get a degree and get out, like my dad said. And it was good advice at the time because I didn't have much direction. And I ended up moving to Florida and becoming a science teacher. And through the first 2 months of that, showing the kids like my view of the world, it made me want to get into research. I love teaching. I fell in love with it. So I started working with Fish and Wildlife and USGS and some of the big dogs. I was in South Florida at the time because I graduated Michigan State. I moved to Florida and I was a teacher there. And so I started working and getting very, enticed with the invasive species work. And so, went right into a graduate program, actually at University of Nebraska, and that sent me into field studies, online courses, but field studies in Puerto Rico, Brazil, and then on layovers, I paid on my own money to extend and then stay with friends who I knew in Florida. At this point, I'd moved back to Michigan, and I was still flying back to Florida, and I had just started volunteering with Fish and Wildlife, catching tegus. I owned one as a pet that my friend had gotten me interested in because South Florida was herp central. And, I started working with venomous snakes down there and, was, within a couple of years had a species list over 150, because the best venomous snake access is there. And so it kind of was this weird path of just having lots of fun with herps, never seeing it as a career, and then kind of falling in love with teaching and research at the same time. And then I moved back to Michigan and finished my master's, started applying for PhD programs, and ended up just on a crapshoot, basically getting a lot of rejections. And then all of a sudden I got, I sent some emails out, and my dream was to study at the University of Cambridge for a long time because, Darwin and Hawking and Newton and Goodall and all of them went there. And, I got an entomologist to agree to let me come work with him for the summer. And so not only did I get to work with a guy who has some stick insects named after him, and he was an amazing entomologist, he happened to work down the hall from Dr. Jason Head, who's the co-discoverer of Titanoboa. And so now I got to bring in herpetology and academics and research and paleontology, and I still knew what I wanted to do, but I was like, the only place I need to be is an academic research institution. I need to be at a university. I love the smell of old books. I want to be funded to catch reptiles, and this is how I'm going to do it. And so, unfortunately, the PhD, I got accepted to work with a PhD offer under Jason Head. The university rejected and wouldn't fund me because it was an ecology conservation offer proposal under a paleontologist, even though he's an ecological paleontologist. So a lot of rejections came. I was frustrated. My husband and I moved to Arizona, and that was because he got a job offer, and I still didn't know what to do. And I just applied to the end of the world and didn't have really a lot of options. This is still tough. And, that's why I tell people academics is 97% rejection. Jason taught me that. So deal with it, suck it up, and keep applying. And so why did I move to Arizona? My husband said, how about we go there? My business is offering me a chance. And I said, Gila Monsters, let's go. I literally said that. And so I moved to the app, one of the pinnacle places in the US for reptiles, became obsessively involved with every rescue, every organization, every nonprofit. And hilariously, I got my rejection from Cambridge 2 weeks after I was hired as a professor at Grand Canyon University in Phoenix. And so even though I'm Jewish, I was hired at a private Christian university, and my dean was a freshwater ecologist, biologist, and my associate dean, who's now the head dean, was an Alzheimer's cancer researcher. And they're both just amazing human beings. And so they didn't have a research program. And so how Pikstein Lab kind of started is crazy. They have something called the Research and Design Program. And at GCU, they really don't have a formal library. They don't have a formal research program. They're an educational institution and massive online programs. I taught on campus and to an extent online, but I wrote a lot of their labs. I launched their pre-veterinary medicine club, which became a major this year, and launched fundamentals of ecology, their course and labs. And so I did a lot of really cool development, but it was all teacher stuff. But what they started doing is rolling out funding where they would fund us and give us funds for our students for supplies and travel if we would take them to symposiums and do field research with them. And so with very little funding, I think it started out like $500 and then ended up being, I think the most they gave us was over $6,000. And that was every year. So I usually got about $3,000 to $6,000 a year. They would just fund whatever I wanted to do, which ended up being a lot of following burrowing owls, beetles, and snakes and lizards around the desert, and going to Florida to work with the Tegus, and going to eventually Texas Christian University, where I would partner with my conservation geneticist, Dr. Dean Williams. And that's where we keep going back to work in his genetics lab. I was just there a few weeks ago. So it grew into this weird conglomerate. And then after, I went back to teaching grade school while still teaching college. And basically this year marked my 13th year as a teacher. And I had been burned out up and down. And I launched Pikstein Laboratory for Conservation Research and Education, Pikstein Lab, as a nonprofit last year. And, there's a lot of things are going on. And one of my good friends from a symposium back in 2018 is Dr. Bill Hayes, who's a phenomenal ecology, behavior, and venom researcher out of Loma Linda University. And we just were kind of zooming and chatting one day about research ideas back and forth, and he's like, why are you doing the work of 3 PhD students without a PhD? Will you just come over here and finish your work? And I was like, oh, yeah, sure. And he's like, no, I'm serious. Apply. I'll get you in my lab. Let's go now. So that conversation was last July. I was enlisted. I met them in August. I was accepted with an offer in October, enrolled for January. So I just finished my first semester PhD. So now I'm a student again, but a student running a nonprofit. And it's been a weird journey, but I think the biggest thing I advocate is that the unconventional path isn't worse. I saved a lot of money. I did take more time. I gained a lot of experience. I've got some holes and gaps in my stats and math abilities, but nothing that bringing on a co-author or spending a tutorial on YouTube can't fix. So that's kind of my long journey, and I'm really excited because next month actually marks my 10-year anniversary of starting my tegu lizard study, and we are finishing the edits on the first paper and launching the mitochondrial study for paper 2, and that's actually now all under my PhD work. So I get more fund. GCU still funds me now. Loma Linda's additionally funding me, so I'm very thankful for both of their funds and emotional support. It's been a crazy journey, but I think it's one that I like to share, even though it's kind of a long-winded answer. I'm sorry, is because I'm a big advocate of I'm bad at math. You can do it too. I've retaken classes. I've switched colleges. I paused. I went back. I took a 4-year, extended master's, and then I did other things quickly. So, it is what it is, but it's been a fun journey to get here. So I love what I do, and I hope to spread that passion.
Yeah. So are you free to talk about your tegu study, or you wait until that's fully finished to talk about it?
I could definitely chat about that. There's a few things I can't go into exact detail on that are a little hidden, but for the most part, I can really much chat about the study and what I share at the symposiums to this point. So we can brag that we completed the most extensive genetic analysis, particularly genomic analysis, ever performed on genus Salvator, which does include Salvator marinae and Salvator rufescens. Sadly, can't get access to Salvator duceni, which is the third in the genus, because there's nothing in the pet trade, nothing in the zoos. Like, I need to go to South America with permits to get it. But really looking at the distinction between the black and white and the red and white Argentine tegu, as they're called, has been a focus of recent. Hybridization in South America was predicted back in 2017 and confirmed in 2020, which was fabulous because they literally caught 75 lizards in this study in 2020, and they 100% looked like either a red or black tegu. Like, there was no, it didn't look like a hybrid, didn't look like any distinction. And for those who don't know what a hybrid looks like, I mean, it can look like anything. It could look like a full one way or the other. It could have the red belly, it could have some markings, it could have some blotches, but there's really no one way they look. But they really did look 100% one or the other. And they found in that study of 75 that 15 were hybridized, and most of them were male to female, red to black direction. So what we're looking at, what I was interested in right away, the initial question of the study was comparing captive breds, which we can argue have been here 20 to 30 years when I started the study. So now let's say 30 to 40 years in captivity as an import for the pet trade. They go back about 70 years or more for skin trade. And what is now known as Tubanambus tegusen, the black and gold or Colombian gold tegu, they've been imported closer to, well over 120 years, 120 years, and they're mostly were skin, and they're less popular in the pet trade because, smaller, flightier, and more aggressive. Although I've seen great things done with them. I think they're highly, undervalued and, underestimated as a pet. But they have a long import history. So I was interested in looking at how the population of captive breds had changed, particularly in comparison to the invasive population. And when you look at the invasive population of southeastern United States, you have three big bubbles in Florida. So you have the South Florida bubble, which runs from about, you could argue, Port St. Lucie all the way down to Key Biscayne, with the bulk of it being between about Davie and Key Biscayne and warehouse districts. And there's two big bubbles there. We have a couple ground zeros we've identified by body size of capture and such with the trappers, private trappers, Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission of South Florida, and USGS, and then the University of Florida. It's like a big cooperative all in that Davie location. And so you have a big population there that's estimated, I'd put it easily at 150 to 300,000. And, they're not even removing what's breeding every year, which is around 1,000 animals a year. So that's your South Florida issue. The north one is in Polk County, and that's the northeast side. They estimate there's about 15,000 there, only a couple dozen. I think the last time I heard there was less than 60 that have been removed. Maybe it might be up to a couple hundred at most, but that population is estimated 5, 10, maybe 15,000 at most. And then there's only been about 200 at most removed from a little bubble on the west coast by the little south of the Panhandle. Then you have your population in Georgia, which is not a couple hours from Atlanta. And it is, right around, they're removing anywhere between 20 to 100 animals a year, still juveniles and adults, no evidence of breeding yet. But that's still quite concerning on the numbers they're removing every year. And then we had a splattering in South Carolina. I believe they're now at 4 or 5 animals and 1 red tegu, by the way. 1 red tegu was found there, and 2 red tegus in the Carolinas, and then 1 red tegu is the only one that's ever been found. It was a male in South Florida in the southern population that I study. I exclusively study that big 150 to 300,000 population in South Florida. And then you have bans. So Georgia hasn't really started banning yet. Florida's done a total ban. South Carolina did a total ban, and then North Carolina with no tegus did a total ban, the only preemptive one. And unfortunately, the biggest thing I argue is all that did is what we knew. I mean, we've been able to see 10 feet ahead, or 10 steps ahead of this thing the whole 10 years I've done this. And all they did was push like a problem that can't be solved in Florida over to Texas, where they have pristine habitat, even better for tegu encroachment, and they don't have laws, and you better believe they won't have laws because it's private land. And so you have all the breeders that have fled there. And so I just did my first keynote in Snake Days, Texas. And even though it's called Snake Days, I talk about tegus, and it was a big invasive species kind of preemptive wake-up call to, like, we need to talk to people who are in charge in Texas. Like, the very least, these animals need to be, like, you need to be inspecting these breeding facilities and make sure they're done right. And it's quite concerning and all that. So that's kind of its own thing. So you have the captive versus invasive, really understanding how the invasive population has changed since they got there, a long history of captive breds, and because they come in on these importation routes, because a lot of people go, well, how can you compare animals that are in breeding facilities and then here and that? Well, if you look at the importation routes and actually do that digging, which you can through records, and I worked with some export importers, particularly Ty Park's farm worked with me a little bit. Guana Land, before they were Guana Land, when they were an importer about 8 years ago, I got samples from them, as well as Exotic Jungle, which is also in Florida. And so those importers helped give me some roots, and basically where they're coming in, you have to imagine there are hundreds and hundreds of small families who go out into the bush, and it's like bushmeat, but it's a pet, right? They're going out and catching 4 to 5 tegus a week. And that is what is, so supporting their whole family. Like, that's literally their income. So it's not as simple as stop the importation. These people are all bringing it, though, to centralized facilities. And those facilities are skin and pet trade consistent routes. And they're from Uruguay, Paraguay, and then to a lesser extent, Brazil. And they have very, 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 strict limits. The biggest bag rates are coming out of Argentina. So you have a lot out of Argentina, a good amount of Uruguay, smaller amount of Paraguay, and a very minimal out of Brazil. Brazil has the biggest restrictions. But most of them are the bag limits, and these were set by Dr. Lee Fitzgerald out of Texas A&M University, for example, set the one on the ones that become cowboy boots. Salvatore Marinay is cleared to have 1.5 million skins become cowboy boots in Texas every year, and that's taken from the wild. So they are actually, Salvatore Marinay, the black and white Argentine tegu, is the world's most commercially exploited reptile, which I think a lot of people aren't aware of. And then we have them, invasive in the Everglades, and now we're just killing them everywhere they are. So now we're not studying their genetics or their behavior, the fact that they're incredibly smart, have high level cognition and problem solving skills, can see in color and identify colors and shapes to get out of mazes. I mean, they have incredible social skills. I mean, anybody who works with tegus is blown away at the level of chillness combined with the level of intelligence. I truly think monitors are smarter, but tegus are more of a pleasure to work with. And, I just think that they're just really disrespected. And when you look at their studies, they're either research, they're studied to be an invasive species, kill it, remove it, or they're studied in medicine, often like a lab rat, morphology, locomotion, spermatozoa production, heart rates, and liver function and disease. So I got really obsessed with this whole idea that no one's telling this animal's story. This is a beautiful animal, arguably a beautiful genus, our group of animals, the Teiids, the Teiidae family. And these really big lizards within Tupinambus and Salvatore, who are just, and that genus was split. While I did my study, I should mention, the 10 years I've been doing it, they split and resplit the genus and organized it. And then they also did a complete genomic sequence on Salvatore Marinay, which saved me a lot of money and time and getting my genetic work done because it creates the roadmap. So with that, what if we I guess I'll kind of fast forward to the results. Something that was a very big confusion from the beginning was a lot of these animals have red bellies. I'm talking like one of my trappers, Rodney Irwin, calls it a fire belly trait. They have usually it'd be white or tan or beige, and they have a bright red, mottled and often solid colored, really red orange belly. And so one of the first things we were able to document was that this was genetic. When I first met Fish and Wildlife, they told me, and I quote, I'm not throw them under the bus, but they're the ones from South Florida, so they're already having a hard time right now with the nail gunning people's pets and all. Let's be honest. But same organization. So they told me that it was tannins in the leaf litter that were being absorbed through their belly scales, and I was like, I don't know about that. That doesn't sound like reptile morphology to me. And talking to some vets, talking to some other people, are like, no. I took some of these animals, Firebelly and Non, into my own care. For months and even years. And not only does the trait maintain, it's not influenced by diet, it is influenced by light, similar to the blue tegu coloration we see on some Salvatore Marinays from that one genetic line that we believe was brought in through Brazil through the original importation by Ron St. Pierre, which he used to own bluetegu.com and all that. But it was one import that came in from a questionable basis where all blue tegus originate, which is why they have a lot of genetic issues and problems. But they're just Salvatore Marinay. Genetically, they're no different. And that was something I wanted to demonstrate. So blue tegus, don't show up anything unique in the genetics. Firebelly trait, nothing unique in the genetics, but it's still unique because it's about 30 to 40% of these invasives in the South Florida pocket, my homestead Davie pocket, but it's only about 5% of captives. So being that there was a red tegu once found, and being that there was hybridization in South America, I was like, what if this is proof of red genes in the South Florida population? And this is important because when you look at hybridization, it should decrease their genetic ability for adaptability. And that's not what we're seeing. And breeding farms, we're seeing similar fecundity. They're breeding regularly and overlap in the wild. So arguably, we're actually dealing with something that's more phenotypic plasticity. They're getting more genetic diversity and adaptability when the red and the black's mixing, which suggests they're more closely related than we understand currently. And so we've been looking at that relationship of their hybridization and this phenotypic plasticity. And the thing we were very excited about was we did identify that there are red tegu genes in the South Florida homestead davy population. We actually found 4 animals with red genes in them, and the highest level was 47%. So that's almost completely 50-50. And what's interesting is because of where they came from and how they were trapped, they were most likely imported with those genes, we believe. So we're going to be able, when we run the mitochondrial, which is what we're doing this fall and winter, we'll actually be able to tell what that other study did, which is it going black to red, red to black, male to female, female to male? What direction is going which way? And we'll be able to identify the mitochondrial if it was something that happened in the Everglades from more recent history, or whether it was a trait it came over with, and you can actually break that down with a familial relationship. So that's what's really cool. The sad part is it had no relationship to the firebelly trait, which I was hoping it did, because that would be cool. There's one of the 4 were a firebelly that had the red genes. It had like 11% red genes. And there were tons of firebellies with no red genes, like tons and tons in my study that had no red genes at all. And he was even able, my geneticist, to separately group the firebellies and to show that they had no population distinction. So that trait is not one that's an indicator of red genes. So that was kind of interesting to break down that, but to find them, you know, and arguably one male did not create these random animals who are in a completely different part of Florida. So we really do think it came over beforehand, and really just spells an issue for their adaptability. We know they have incredible adaptability, almost like a great white shark, to have some endothermic abilities for adaptation below freezing. They have an incredible varied diet, incredibly varied habitat ability, from wetland to grassland to dry scrub brush, all sorts of stuff, different elevations, different habitat niche development. They can live almost anywhere. And then the really big part is the brain to body ratio. They have an incredibly large brain to body ratio, a crinkled brain, and more so like an upper level monitor brain. Monitors and tegus have a very similar brain morphology, even though it's convergent evolution. They diverged about 45 million years ago when the plates split. But what's interesting is they just have incredible cognitive abilities. And when you're smart, that brain to body ratio, unbelievably, that actually makes a formidable invasive when you compare, and that was part of my master's work, was, kind of really trying to understand on my own in some of my final works for my degree, was when I got to kind of pick my topic, I was what makes something a successful invasive, and how do we stop them? How many successful invasions have been removed, and what makes them similar? And the 2 things that come out are brain to body ratio and adaptability of habitat and diet. And the tegu is the worst in all those categories for Florida. Way more diverse than the berm. Their ability to even to command habitat ranges, they've been documented on radio collars commanding 3-mile territory circumferences in South Florida. These males, they move, and so it's a really big problem if you're going to add in now genetic phenotypic plasticity, a genetic adaptability. It just gives them one more card in their table. And so that's really interesting. And, I think the idea to study invasive species from a genetic aspect is really, really interesting. The next thing I really want to do is trace this back to South America, confirm those importation routes, look at how genetic diversity is being exploited regionally. I definitely think we need to look at the taxonomic classification of genus Salvator. I think there's more befuddling and moving around to happen. I definitely think Tubinambus and Salvator, though, should remain separated. The main reason being, their diet's different, their behavior's different, their size is different, their location's different. But the biggest is the L'Oreal scale, which is the scale that occurs between the eye and the nose. And there's 1 on the Tubinambus group and 2 on the Salvator group. So I do believe in the genus separation, but I believe there's more delineation to occur. And I'm not a big taxonomic buff where I'm like, I need to do taxonomy. And in fact, it scares me a little, because of all the horror stories we see of the people who overgroup and undergroup and whatever the heck is going on with that guy. Is it New Zealand or Australia who keeps like popping out 6 species a month and freaking everybody out? And he's like publishing in a paper he created. Have you ever heard about that? It's like, I've been taught every conference I go to, someone's talking about this crazy New Zealand guy. He's either New Zealand or Australia, but he's creating some problems there with the venomous snake people. And reclassifying everything. So I don't want to do that. And I also like to point out too that in reclassifying, it's a conservation issue. You know, if you split something, it might struggle to get a status. If you put things together, you can increase the size of a population and make them no longer threatened, or they lose their status. So I definitely don't want to go loosey-goosey playing with that. I'm more going to stick to the genetics aspect of here's what we found, and from that, my geneticist will kind of suggest what we see. But I think it's really interesting to see phenotypic plasticity where we expect it not to be. And they're doing really similar studies, I should mention. I've seen several researchers since I started my PhD who actually came to talk at our university who are doing similar stuff with bumblebees, anoles, geckos, and I just saw a presentation where I was a keynote at Snake Days in Texas, where they were doing work with whiptail lizards that had, and that's teiids. Those are teiids. So they're having very similar overlaps. And they've done some similar work also with, my geneticist does work with horned lizards. And just the idea of how this plasticity happens when, like, for example, you can take a horned lizard group that's been removed from the wild, and now you're trying to, relocate them and reestablish them, but you're adding different groups and different genetics each year. And now you're comparing the ones who are established to the ones in captivity to the ones in the wild. And you're looking at like the genetic versus the physiology and the ecology and how they all come together. So that's what's really exciting. So I think the most exciting, I think I've hit all the really exciting parts. The other really exciting thing we found that I can talk about for paper 1 that's comparing the captives and invasives, which is, as you would expect, captive breds are bigger, heavier, more robust. The females often have jowl development. I mean, there's big animals. They're often higher white in coloration, and it's because we're breeding them that way. That's not a surprise. What is a surprise is that they are more genetically robust. The captive breds are thankfully being bred in a way, especially the breeders I worked with enough mixed samples, you wouldn't believe it. They have about 3 to 4 times the genetic robustness of the invasives, which really what that says is that the breeders who are doing tegus, at least the ones I work with, well, shout out to Hector of Hector's Habitat and Jesse of Jesse's Jungle, are fabulous, as well as Ty Park of Iguana Land, although I think because of the laws in Florida, he's not selling tegus anymore.
I'd be surprised if he was.
I was going to say he's not, but Hector stopped breeding, sadly. Jesse moved to Texas. He's the last one I know who's doing good stuff. But they just do really good breeding. And then the second aspect, I think, is that the invasive population is a founder population. And that's another thing that we declared, that we believe confirmed, is that they were just a small group and they bred to this extent, meaning they were probably from one import facility that had really probably had exploited only 1 or 2 importation routes out of Argentina or Uruguay, because they're very genetically similar. But it's interesting that the captive breds and invasives are unbelievably genetically distinct. And that was very surprising, like to the extent that it's surprising that they're the same species. Like, they're definitely the same species, but for members of the same species, how distinct they were was like, my geneticist was like, this is crazy high. Our FST, which is basically, you have an FST is a score that looks at genetic variation and diversity. And so a score of 0 basically says that you're the same, and a score of 1 says that you're different, right? Same species, different species. And so they came out as a 0.34, which is very, very high and very unusually high, which basically says there's absolutely no gene flow between them. So yes, they're still the same species, but they were probably exploited from completely different roots, and they've had completely different evolutionary lineages. While the captive breds are getting new genes come in, like I know Hector's Habitat was importing from Argentina with wild caught stuff, and he was incorporating fresh genetics like that. Even the animal wasn't pretty. He knew the genetics. He wanted to pull that out of the genetics, knowing that it's not surface level. And, he has a science background, so that didn't surprise me that he really knew how to go below the surface and know that genetic, variability there, even though he's tech, but, he was breeding bearded dragons in college, and he got big into that. So that was really interesting, knowing that the captive bred stock is healthier than we'd assume, and that the invasive species population, at least the homestead, is much more restricted in their genetics, which that spells good news, especially if they're experiencing the phenotypic plasticity, because then they have to ride against that low genetic diversity to begin with. The last thing that we found that was quite interesting is we did scale counts. So we did scale counts on a variety of different parts on the body. And what we found was that there is a much higher scale count on average, like 2 or 3 scales more on the invasive population compared to the captive bred. And those occur in 3 places. It's the ring under the eyes, known as the ocular scales, the upper lip, the supralabials, and the lower lip, the infralabials. And and you would think like, okay, well, does their nose longer? And if we didn't measure the ratios of the skull, that's something I want to do eventually, because I do have all these amazing, thousands of pictures of the sides of these animals' faces. And there's really cool technology. Actually, paleontology uses it more. And you can like pick spots on the picture and it'll measure the proportions. I want to look at proportions of like snout to nostril, nostril to eye, eye to ear, ear to back of jaw, and look at like that breakdown of the skull ratio. So that's one day, hopefully, because I have the technology and the resources. I just, another project for the book. But the scale count actually doesn't change. That's why we use them to quantify families like Tegus and Tupinamas versus Salvatore, like I said, with the L'Oreal scale, is it quantifies groups, and it's very consistent. They're born all the scales they'll ever have unless they get injured. And that will stay throughout their life. And it's used to quantify populations as well as taxonomy. And so I kind of invented some of my own scale counts, which didn't work out, but they were fun. Just some places to count scales randomly to see if there'd be variation. And then the scales that were meant to be the same, like L'Oreal scales, were consistent, unless I said like there was an injury or damage to the face. Was the only time that happened, maybe 3 or 4 times out of 600. And then, yeah, they had just had more skills. And so there's 2 reasons why we have hypothesized that the invasive population would have a higher scale abundance. And in other studies, they've shown that it increases thermo and osmoregulation. So your better ability to monitor your body's fluids, your hydration levels, as well as your temperature if you have more scales. And it's just about like it comes down to physics. It's just how it works with the surface area. And then the second thing we came up with actually comes from military technology in the United States back in the 1950s and earlier. And that's the idea of disruptive coloration. And so the idea is that, you can take cells or replace that word with scales. And the more scales you have, the more colors per scale. As you increase that, it exponentially increases the difficulty of the observer to find the object. And this is how we actually designed everything from military, covers that go over the Jeeps, the painting that goes on the military vehicles, and even the soldiers' clothes. And so it was really interesting. So if you apply that principle, and I actually made a cool little graphic that I can send to you that basically took 4 animals, and so like that go from really easy to count to hard to count. And it's a very simple count. The top of their head is a picture, and there's supposed to be 3 scales on the top of each of their eyes. And so if you try to count and you just go to each animal, you can see that by the 4th animal, you can't even count. I actually had to feel with my fingers to count that animal appropriately, because it's so radically speckled that you just can't see them, even in person, let alone a picture. So that disruptive coloration. So those are the 2 hypotheses we felt for the higher scale count. Like I said, I do believe they are hybridizing because they're more closely related than we think. In South America, and they came over with those genes, they spread that. So kind of dissecting all of this is a hot mess right now, but that's so far where we're at. And we have a few things that we can't announce with like the genetic results, but the paper 1 we're working on right now is in final edits. We should have that applied in the next couple weeks. And paper 2, the mitochondrial study, we'll be doing the mitochondrial analysis this fall and winter, and rolling it out probably for publication early next year. So hang in tight. It'll be soon. I'll have more to say, but lots to talk about. It's exciting. The more we ask, the more we uncover, and then we kind of go back to the beginning just with more questions every time.
Yeah. Speaking of tegus, habitat and diet plasticity, what would you say is their potential range of expansion here in North America?
That's a really good question. And it's definitely one I always get asked, how many are there and how far will they spread? It's tough. I will say that they really cannot survive long-term below freezing temperatures. So these studies, which, the Burmese studies always made me very angry. USGS put out a lot of bad, Burm studies.
Yeah, I saw those crazy maps with berms all the way up to Kentucky. So.
Yeah, and they were like, well, what they did, and it's funny, while I was in grad school, that was one of the things I got to write about. And thankfully, by then, other papers had said, you're stupid. I didn't have to. But they just used basic climate change modeling on the spread, and they didn't enter species data like the temperature they need to digest food, the temperature they need to breed. The bottom line is Burmese pythons cannot breed or digest food north of Orlando. They can survive like a little bit, but they really can't survive well, and they definitely can't breed. but they are spreading to the mangroves and the islands, and they are very salt tolerant and can hold their breath a long time. And the tegus can do that too. Tegus have been documented holding their breath over 22 minutes and being caught in nets at sea by fishermen off of South America and Central America. So we know they do that. I would say they can spread, really to areas that are not freezing. I think they would establish unbelievably perfectly better than they ever have anywhere in Texas, unfortunately. I think they could do well in some parts of places like Kansas that don't get consistent freezes. Even like Louisiana, New Orleans, like basically anywhere that they have, because they can survive in, they really can't do desert. I will say that. They're not going to get out here and survive in Arizona. It's just too hot, it's too dry. So the extremes of hot and dry are going to be a bigger risk to them than cold, especially with freezings too. But they can survive. I mean, they've been documented surviving 30, 40 degree temperatures at the surface and below freezing by burrowing. Burmese pythons, when it gets cold, they actually come out and bask. They don't go down because they're from a part of Asia where, they just don't have colds. But tegus are from South America, and Argentina gets winter and it gets below freezing. So they can survive a couple weeks or, a certain time period, but they just can't survive like a Michigan winter. So I would say it's tough. Without looking at a U.S. map right now, without all the temperatures listed on it, I would say that mid-Georgia, and then probably as far as like parts of Texas, New Orleans, that's as far west. As far east, I think they could take the entire East Coast, minus the heavy winters. So all the Carolinas were very smart to preemptively ban, even though I hate to do that. I hate to say that we can't have reptiles, it's sad that the people who ruin it for everybody make it so that we can't have it. I'd rather see stricter laws, like file a permit, make someone go through a bunch of hoops than just to say no tegus or no whatever. I'm a big advocate of that. Like, it's like gun safety. Don't take away guns and reptiles. Just make it so the right people have them, make it hard to get and difficult to get the really dangerous ones. And, and then the right people have them, not the crazy people who let their Burmese python in the unlocked cage with their 3-year-old kid, and it kills the kid. And, and then that was what initiated the Lacey Acts in Florida. Was not the python hunts. It wasn't the oh my God, the python's going to eat your kid or eat your dog. It wasn't any of that. It was someone's Burmese python killing a kid, a pet in an unlocked cage in a bedroom in a house that killed a kid. And that was what helped spur it along, because a senator goes, I'm gonna make this my platform. And that, and so then you get like, they overdo it. They overdo the laws. So like I mentioned earlier, you got Fish and Wildlife, instead of putting more efforts to go remove invasives, you're nail gunning people's pets. And then you're killing parts that are legal because you don't even double check your work. So it's like, it's so frustrating inside and out because it's so political and tied. But I think the tegus could easily establish anywhere that has a significant amount of either wetland, scrubland, savanna grassland, or deciduous coniferous type forest that does not get extreme heat. And honestly, and they bask in 100 degrees. So like, we're talking like, it just doesn't need to get, like, if they have access to water, they can deal with heat. Like, people in Arizona keep their tegus outside. So they can deal with it if they're close enough to water. So there's probably pockets they can even survive in Arizona, but I doubt it, because you always hear about them being found, dumped, and burned in the desert, and it's sad. So I honestly think that they can spread anywhere that doesn't have extreme cold, long winters, and it doesn't have extreme drought, hot and drought combos. And so you're talking easily a third of the United States. And most of it being in that bottom right corner where they already are. So how far could it spread? I think Georgia is not, they're just removing them, and it's very lackadaisical. You're just giving them time to breed. North Carolina, South Carolina did a great job. Florida, too sorry, too far gone. I don't know why are you even wasting your time at this point?
Cat's already out of the bag.
Exactly. You'll be flooded to Lake Okeechobee in the next 20 to 30 years. So, we'll reassess it then, maybe. Will you even have invasive species? Will we push up north? But I think the biggest concern, the one I'm really most focused on, is Texas. And that's just because it has the greatest range of pristine habitat, the loosest laws, the loosest regulations, and it'd be the most unlikely to make any kind of regulation on private land. And this is kind of the speech I gave to those in Texas at the keynote a couple weeks ago, was just like, unfortunately, like, Texas is going to be its own biggest problem, and that it's not going to want, the key with invasive species is prevention and then quick action, worst case. And they never do that. Everybody just sits back and catches a couple and does some press releases. And the important thing I always like to point out is we actually have something called the invasive species curve. You can just Google, it's under Google Images. You can just Google invasive species curve. It comes out of a textbook. And it basically shows this curve of like, as the population increases, like how likely you are to address or remove it. And there's this amazing spot right in the middle where it says, public awareness begins, problem is considered unlikely to be solved. So if you look at that, everything you know about invasive species, now you know the answer. All the media garbage is just meant to generate attention and anger to help push the politics, to give them funding. At the end of the day, by the time we know about it, it's too late. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do something about it. There's only been less than a dozen successful complete invasive eradications in the world. And that includes plants and animals and fungus. There's less than a dozen. And it's really, they're tough to deal with. That's why we have to be preventative. And on a side note, I would say not only preventative, we have to stop being stupid. We have to stop wasting time on things that are not invasive, like the Mediterranean gecko. I have seen 3 presentations in a year at between 5 conferences, scattered, on the Mediterranean gecko and how invasive it is. And every time I raise my hand and ask the same question, I go, great presentation, but what damage is it causing? Oh, well, we hypothesize it might spread disease, or it might do this, or I go, no, but you haven't documented it. It's never been documented. Arguably, everything I've seen, they haven't documented them spreading disease. They fill an ecological niche. Like, we do not have arboreal nocturnal reptiles or anything that really fills that niche in Arizona. They don't have a competitor. And my little fence lizards and Mediterranean geckos at my house, I've been watching their populations for 5 years I've lived here, and everything I do just makes them both more abundant, giving them habitat and lights and water dishes, and they love it. And I like to look at that interaction. But to me, it's like, if you can't cause something invasive until it has been established to cause damage economically, environmentally, what have you. So that's a problem too, is we're not being preventative, and then we're over focusing and under focusing. And just another number I like to give, just the state of Florida alone, they have $1.5 million allocated every year, last I checked, for invasive plant removal. They don't have a single dollar allocated toward invasive animal removal. Again, last time I checked, which was a couple years ago, but I'm pretty sure it's the same because it never changes. And they work on volunteers. And every time I go down there, they've got a dozen animals and 2 are missexed out of every dozen. And they're adult tegus with buttons, with their buttons on each side of their cloaca. You don't even have to probe them. So it's like, it's a really frustrating thing. Definitely invasive species research is known as the nasty necessity. It lives up to that name. I own tegus. I love them. They're my passion in life, but I have to dissect a lot of dead ones. I have to remove animals knowing they're going to be killed, and that's tough. But, and of course, everybody's screaming on the sidelines, what about the cats? So that, don't get me started. That'd be a whole other podcast. So.
Yeah. 2 things off of that. One, I have a friend down in Florida who says he herps out in the cane fields. They points out all those mysterious concrete structures in the middle of cane fields and says that's where FWC grows their propaganda pythons. And 2, I noticed how you didn't mention tegus being a problem in Louisiana. And I think I know why. It's because Cages view them as just a miniature alligator with no season limit and no tag limit. So
they're established. They're considered established. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. You said established. You said where they might be. Louisiana. Oh no, that whole map. Louisiana, Mississippi. You know what? Those areas I am not as concerned, and the reason is,
like I was saying, Cages view them as just a natural extension of their diet. So
it would be. So the only issue is that they don't do as well when it gets in a wet area, but the biggest concern is like in South America, one of their main staples of their diet is caiman eggs. And so they are specializing on alligator, crocodile, American crocodile, American alligator, and cooter eggs. I know they've at least been confirmed messing with the nest of an American crocodile. And then we do have a camera shot with one with an alligator egg in its mouth eating the nest. And that was like in 2012. That was the money shot that made headlines and all that famous picture. And they've also done a bunch of evidence of them destroying turtle nests. So they do have a lot of evidence of that, but you're right, with no bag limit and a lot of like early awareness, they would be on that. And like places like Louisiana, Mississippi, their biggest issues hilariously are more pollution, like water pollution, contamination, things like that. They do a great job with their sturgeon recovery, their snapping turtle recovery, American alligator conservation. A lot of that's done very, very well. And Missouri too. Yeah, Missouri, Mississippi, Louisiana, all that area. But yeah, no, you're right. If you have no bag limit and just let them open season, like, I mean, that's how you got to deal with invasive species. Either teach humans that they taste good or they can be used for an economic purpose, and you just let them go. And that's how you remove invasive species. It's, you know, it's tough to direct humans towards exploitation correctly.
Yeah. So it says on your website that Pikstein Labs also works a lot with varanids. You want to go into that at all?
To a small extent, I really, really wish I had worked more with monitor lizards. So I've done a lot just personally with like rehabilitating them, clicker training. One of my good friends is an awesome zookeeper. Her name is Brooke, and she's an amazing zookeeper down in Florida. And she works at the Busch Gardens Wildlife Theme Park now down there, and she is doing incredible things. But her background was with Komodo dragons and crocodiles, and she did clicker training with Komodo dragons. And so I was inspired by that to do a lot of clicker training and other work with similar large animals. And I'm very connected locally with the Phoenix Herpetological Sanctuary. Awesome organization, really good people, and getting to work with some of their big lizards and stuff. I've owned some monitors. I really, really want to do studies on comparative evolution and ecology between varanids and teiids. And the last time, unfortunately, I touched this was working with the University of Cambridge in my proposal, actually, to work with Jason Head. My plan with him was to study the coevolution of varanids and teiids that lived on the palm oil farms between Brazil and Indonesia, where Cambridge had some research sites already established. And basically the goal was to look at tegus in Brazil on palm oil farms, and then monitors in Indonesia on palm oil farms, and looking at like their niche capacity and how they filled that. Yes, they're convergent evolution of 45 million years separate, but I mean, there's so much in common that they have. And I'd really like to do, you know, behavioral studies as well as evolutionary studies. But sadly, that's kind of it's a paused area of my study. But I really would love to learn more about that, because I think, I mean, if you Google it or look it up, nobody's really comparing varanids and teiids. Nobody really looks at them and compares them, especially the larger ones. You know, big lizards and big snakes are my personal favorite. And there's been so much done comparing boids and pythons, for example. Lots and lots done comparing them. Their morphology, their breeding, their behavior, all that. And really nothing on teiids and varanids. So I think that's a really just, you know, so much research I want to do in so little time.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll go back to teiids. So with the populations in Florida, and well, invasive population in general, being a lot more genetically bottlenecked than the private captive population, do you think that could eventually lead to a loss of genetic plasticity in the future?
That's a really, really good question. I would say that it's good. It's, you know, I wish I understood genetics a little more to answer that properly. I feel like my geneticists would give a much better answer than me. But I feel like if you have a bottlenecked population with limited genetics, but they have that phenotypic plasticity in a few of them, that it definitely helps them out. It definitely puts them in a better place. The real question is that we also are still adding genetics to them. So I would say if they were left like that as a bottleneck, I think they're genetically robust enough to survive and do well. It is still limited, so their long-term potential, I think that is kind of questionable, because they aren't really genetically reduced, but there aren't a huge, there's hundreds of thousands of them now. So like, at some point they're going to hit like a plateau. But I think in general, they're going to be fine. And the reason is it has nothing to do with the genes they came over with. It's the releases. So the media always blames individual pet owners, and that's not really true. We know that in South Florida, this big population I study was actually released purposefully by a man who was from Madagascar, who was, everything was getting loose, and he was getting investigated by Fish and Wildlife, and he basically dumped everything and got in trouble. And that's where the ground zero is, which is an avocado grove down in Homestead. And that's where all these, this huge population originally came from, and arguably where probably most of it
It's always some fruit tree stand in Florida that has an invasive lizard in it.
Yes, it is. It's a big avocado grove of 3 acres, and it's honestly, it's not even like 30 minutes from Billy Bob's Swamp Safari, if you know where that is. It's just like down the street from it, maybe like 30 minutes or so. So you have this ground zero, and that man was like investigated, arrested, and deported back to Madagascar. Then there's, and I forget the name, it was like Raj or Raul. I have like a record of like his arrest record. It was an R name, but I don't know the last name, but it was, anyways, he went back to Madagascar, and I don't know what happened there. The northern population, the one in Polk County, that's northeast, right? So that one of the 5 to 15,000 was released by a guy named Bobby Hill, who is very well known in the reptile trade. And I believe he's currently in prison, or might have been released now, but he was in prison, if he's not still there, for a very long time. Lots of illegal stuff beyond just black market reptile trade. But when he was investigating something, dumped it, and that's from that population. We don't know where the other ones, I haven't been able to find any other record or source of the other ones, but they are all individual releases. There was a student who did it for his PhD dissertation. You can find it online. They did a study between the northern and southern Florida populations on the East Coast, and they found them genetically distinct. And hilariously, their histogram of their FST scores is almost identical to mine, comparing captives and invasives. So we do know these are really distinct populations. But to answer your question, the most dangerous thing for South Florida is the individual releases. So these individual releases might not have caused it, but they're still happening, and they're connecting, and they're breeding. So in my genetic study, we were able to show two things two things came up in the genetic run that I had predicted. One is I knew that people were catching these animals and reselling them back in the pet trade. And two, I knew that there were still individual releases happening. So what you get is this histogram that's half blue and half orange, representing my invasive and my captive. But in the blue, there's some orange lines. And in the orange, there's some blue lines. And that's exactly what that is. Those are animals who are 100% genetically distinct from those populations. That's because you were caught and resold to here in the pet trade, and you got loose from the pet trade and are now invasive. So that's happening. And I'm talking, my sample size, my N is 468. We ran data on 320 something. And then I ran blood on 120 something. And just from the 120 something blood samples, there were 7. There were 3 who've been resold in the pet trade, and there were 4 who were released individual animals, just from that. So we're now about to run the other 100 or 2 blood samples I have. I have to go through them and develop that because we got more funding. The only reason why was the funding. So we got more funding to run that, but my geneticist anticipates the results will only be reinforced because of how strong they are and consistent. So that's the problem. I would say that the bottleneck hurt them, but not that much. The phenotypic plasticity is helping them, but it's only a few in the population. But the biggest thing is that we're still releasing animals, and they're still adding to the genetic pool. And since we know how robust the captive bred genetic pool is, 3 to 4 times that of the invasives, that's where we're going to be screwed.
Yeah.
Use my language, but you know what? We need language like that in this time period because we are screwing ourselves.
Yeah.
It's frustrating.
Yeah. So what would you say is what would you recommend as the path forward to dealing with the invasive populations of Argentine tegus?
I think that's a really good question. Coming up with an answer is easier than achieving one. And that's because of all the red tape, the loopholes, the politics, the public, and all that. But if you were to say what works, I would put it into a threefold plan. One is anywhere that they are currently, I would say in all U.S. states, add them to the Lacey Act, Tegus, which will stop state-to-state travel. And I know herpers don't like to hear that, but it helps. That's one of the best, honestly. You've got to stop or restrict state-to-state travel. And maybe don't stop it entirely, but have it where like there's an additional form of paperwork that shows where that animal came from. Have more of a paper trail. That would be step 1. So we can restrict that. Step 2 would be having, basically a United States invasive species predictor list. Like if something's been invasive in one place, it is highly likely to be invasive somewhere else. They should be on a list, and they should have a separate protocol for, like I said, like state-to-state movement. My goodness, like if I get a skunk, I've had a skunk before. And when you get a skunk, every state has different laws. It's either a no or it's a yes with lots of permits. If it's a yes with lots of permits, like Michigan, you can't even touch that animal until you show up with the permits. In Florida, you're supposed to do that, but you can still buy it from the pet store, sign a paperwork, and then get your permit in the mail. But you still have to like give your ID to the state. They have to send paperwork to the state. The state knows you own that animal, and the animal's microchipped. So like if we could just like make a better process, like instead of saying people can't have them, like better monitor or restrict state to state movement, have each state, like, don't just say, oh, this state's dealing with tegus. The whole US should deal with Salvatore marinae and say, this is a high risk invasive species, just like Burmese pythons, just like, all, you know, Phragmites australis grass, just like bussel grass, like, you know, like these things are high, you know, goldfish, African clawed frogs, you know, rusty crayfish, damn it. Like there's a lot of invasive species that just pop up again and again and again, red-eared sliders. So put them on a list and say, for these animals, restrict or stop state to state movement. Have them where like you have, if you buy them, purchase them, own them, or whatever, you have to register them with the state just to better track their movement. And like, and that way we can still keep them. And then really you have to have either A, don't allow them to be bred outdoors. B, don't let them to be bred at all in states where they can become invasive. Or C, like just have restrictions. You know, your facility is inspected. You know, you must have these requirements. Like, you know, like Florida was ridiculous. They made 2 years of requirements to improve cages and microchip stuff. Made breeders I know who are respectable, honorable people who are amazing at what they do, and made them run and spend thousands of dollars to do all this stuff. And then they just banned it and made them get rid of everything anyways. It was like, why would you do that to them? You know, it stressed them out and made them waste tons of money. So it's the problem is these laws don't hurt the stupid people who cause them. They only hurt the good people who are making profit and being stable on it. So like US ARC is a good organization. You know, they really try. They're the only ones out there, but like a lot of the stuff they advocate for, I don't agree with, because like it's a lot of like all or nothing. And that's what the state's doing. We need to find a common ground for that. And the key is prevention and regulation and maintenance. I know nobody wants to hear like, oh, it's that hard. I can't just go up to an expo and just buy a tegu. But like, I mean, we've all been to expos. Like, we like them, yes. But aren't we tired of seeing too many animals shoved in a cage and sick and half dead imports who get imported and given no food and water and kept in a cold box and sold to you? Who knows the last time they were treated properly, and they die when you get them home in a week, like a goldfish from the fair. You know, like, I mean, I think as herpers and herpetologists together, we need to combine as hobbyists and herpetologists and academics. We need to come together and say enough is enough. We want an ethical pet trade or none at all. And I really think that we have to crack down on that. And you know, and the thing I would add too is, you know, one of the scariest things is disease. You know, what we're not seeing, there is a huge issue right now with the disease coming from the Burmese pythons and affecting a lot of creatures. We have yellow scale fungus in the Northeast and other parts. On the West Coast, we have a whole bunch of stuff. I forget what the one disease that's spreading right now through gopher and king snakes and rattlesnakes. And I just got an email. One of my lab mates just went to a conference and was talking to someone about diseases. And one that I've never even heard of, I wanted to ask if you'd heard of this. It's called pennistomes.
Yeah, I've heard of pennistomes.
So pennistomes, they're confirmed in Burmese pythons. They're confirmed in tegus in South Florida. They're in the lungs, and apparently they're not killing them. They're spreading it to natives and killing them. And so now, if we're looking at it from a disease aspect, now it's even more concerning. Now it's even like, I do want to ban, because I'm buying a tegu. How do I know it wasn't resold from the Everglades with pennistomes, and now it's going to spread through my whole collection? So to me, this is really concerning for, you know, the contamination of our native herpetofauna and our wildlife. You know, so I think, unfortunately, we need more laws, we need more funding, we need more consistency. But if the industry, you know, the people like, you know, us, the hobbyists and the academics combine and can fight to have better standards, you know, the pet trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry. But I always say, if you're selling a living thing, you sell part of your soul along with it. There's right and wrong ways to do it, but even if doing it in the best way, you can't guarantee what's going to happen to that animal when it goes there, you know, and that's kind of what I mean by that, not to knock my breeders, you know, but, you know, it's tough, but I think it comes down with responsibility, whether you're buying, selling, trading, owning, rescuing, we need to be responsible. We need to be better, because we're going to cause, you know, a lot of really, you know, dangerous issues. So I think that's what I would like to see. But the biggest thing is prevention. If other people can do what North Carolina did with the full ban, but like, I don't know. It's tough. I'd like to see more common sense and compromise, but I think the best thing for our wildlife is a complete ban because we're not going to get that compromise. We're going to get all or nothing. And unfortunately, like I've had this talk with many herpetologists and herpers, and it's a very divisive topic, just like free handling venomous. It's would
I
you
don't think free handling venomous is that divisive. I think it's just plain stupid.
It is absolutely plain stupid. Or we'll say, well, let's pick another one. The argument of venomous versus poisonous and whether that matters or not. Which, you know,
I think I heard someone say that the English language is the only language that differentiates between the two. So
it's one of the only languages that differentiates, and it was used as a synonym for a long time. My thing is that if you're doing medical care, a lot of people in venom say that it is important because it's about the delivery, you know. And if you're describing like a keelback, for example, that makes venom from a poison, like you got to have some kind of terminology. I know I truly stand on that one. I agree. Free handling stupid, and I like two words, the poison and venomins. But it's a similar kind of fight. But this fight is, I think, one that people have a harder time dealing with. It's a selfish one. The question is, would you give up owning specific reptiles if it meant conserving them as a whole? As a species. Like people will tell me, what if you could never own a tegu again? Because I have, I have 3 and I've had as many as 20 at one time. I've rescued dozens. I can't live without my tegus. What if you could never own a tegu again, but it saved them in the wild? And I would do it. I would do it. Now, I wouldn't let them take away my pets. I would run and hide like some hermit in the hills because no one touches my children, but my fuzzy, scaly children. But I would give that up. I think that we need to put conservation above our own selfish need to have like, I must have my bucket list lifers of these animals. And I don't know. I think that's a tough thing to swallow. And I think that's where myself and US ARC kind of hit a wall, is that, they're defending the rights of the owners, but like, there's just so much abuse in the pet trade. And why aren't we calling that out like we are fish and wildlife and what happened in South Florida? Like we should be calling out the abuse and neglect of the pet trade the same way. And I think it's beautiful seeing like Ty Park, how did he deal with it? He dealt with a law change by becoming a zoo. I mean, like that was already in the works, but that was a lot of part of it was all the law changes. The law changes most affected tegus, and second was iguanas. A lot of the iguanas on that list. So, I mean, I think that was one of the most brilliant things to do, was make an education, research center and all that, but at the same time, I do have to add, I have heard there's some loose tegus around Ty Park Zoo. Heard that from like 5 different people. I can't confirm it. IHS next year I'm one of their board members, and the International Herpetological Symposium is at Ty Park's Iguana Land next year. We're very excited about that. And I will personally be herping looking for wild tegus to confirm or deny that claim. So I don't want to spread rumors, but I've heard it. But you just never know. When you have a big population of animals, it's almost inevitable. So I think the best thing would be breeding requirements to make them indoors, and have really strict requirements, and have them in states where you can't breed them. But I honestly think that the pet owners aren't the issue. It's not individual pets. We need to be restrictive of breeding and importing facilities, but they're not the ones that are in the news. They're not the ones that get in trouble. And they're not the ones that are being blamed and focused on. It's the pet owners. We're being blamed constantly as we're the ones releasing them, and we're having our pets killed by the Fish and Wildlife and blamed and making these big news articles. But where are the people who are doing this? Where is that happening? So, it's tough.
Yeah, but also I'd like to point out that oftentimes, legislators that make laws often don't know what they're talking about.
Of course, yeah. Absolutely.
For example, here in Ohio, went from one of the most laissez-faire states when I was really young to one of the strictest states in terms of exotic laws, all because of what happened in Zanesville all those years ago.
Right. Oh, with the loose tiger and bear and lions and right?
Yeah,
wow,
yeah. So of course, so of course, a bunch of reptiles that weren't involved with that got restricted as well, because But one of the dumber things in that was the large constrictor laws. Like last time I checked in Ohio, you can own all the large constrictors, your eunectes, your python, all these bigger species legally. However, as soon as they hit 12 feet long, then you need to go get a permit.
What?
Yeah,
that's crazy.
Last time I checked, that was a law. So
in Michigan, it's so funny. It's by like the city or township. Like every little entity makes its own rule, and they all have a different length, but it's usually 6 or 8 or 10 feet. It's even less, and it's almost often 6 feet. And I actually had an issue where like a neighbor, I had this is like 8 or 10 years ago in Michigan. I had a lot of tegus at the time, and I was renting from my sister-in-law, and I had my tegus out on the porch, and a couple of them just, got loose because, it does happen, even if it was to me, but I was in Michigan, so, winter kills them. I would be a little bit more careful probably in Florida, and I'm more careful now. But they climbed up if you ever seen like those screened-in porches, there was a screened-in porch, and I got like hide areas and water and chill areas for them, and all that. And I've got like 4 of them out there, and it's got like a 2-foot wall of like metal around the base. So you think they won't climb up? They had climbed on a chair, clawed out the screen 2 feet up, and flopped out. And yeah, that's how they got out. They're very smart. So you can't. Well, in the 5 minutes it took me to go to the bathroom, by the way, they weren't unsupervised more than about 5 to 7 minutes. But and what's crazy is once one learns how to get out, they all do in a matter of minutes. So there were 3 out, and it was under 7 minutes. It was insane. So anyways, I found 2 of them very quickly, and then the one was at like the neighbor's gate. They're all in my backyard, just like right like 5 feet away, just walking around, not really even trying to get away. And my female, because they're outside and they get, excited and stuff. My female was newer and she was an adult. And I went, when I found her by the neighbor's fence, I picked her up and she was opening her mouth and hissing. And the neighbors came over and asked. I was like, oh, just talking to them and showing them. And they were like, oh, I'm sorry. It just got out of the porch. I'm going to go put her back. Like, that hasn't happened before. They called the cops on me. They called the cops and they said I had dangerous reptiles. I will say that 2 weeks prior, we had brought home a new dog, a 6-month-old pit bull from the Humane Society, and she was she's our angel. She's she volunteers at children's hospitals, and like she's a dog ambassador. She's just a phenomenal therapy dog, and just the sweetest little pit bull in the world. But they had tried calling on the pit bull 2 weeks earlier because we brought it home, and our city actually not only didn't have dog laws, Michigan had voted that year to make a anti-breed ban law. Basically, it said that breed bans were based not on science, but ignorance. And it outlawed the ability for anybody to make a breed ban in the state of Michigan. And they lifted them, and they just said townships can make rules about how you walk your dog with like a muzzle or what based on certain breeds or whatnot. So I actually had printed it out and gave it to her and be like, you can't say shit about my dog. Get out of here. You can't say anything about my dog. So 2 weeks later, God forbid, they call on me about the reptiles. And so officers knocked on my door. And they came in and they go in my reptile basement and they say, I've got 5 adult tegus, 3 juvenile tegus, and a 3-foot rat snake and an 8-foot red-tailed boa. The only thing they were upset about was the big constrictor, who, by the way, was like 15 years old and used in education for his whole life, was tame. I mean, come here, you get 3 kids over here, you wrap them around their neck. Like he was just like a rubber toy. He was so chill. And so they were like, how big is that? And like right away, knowing the law, I was like, under 6 feet. Response. It didn't work. They didn't measure him, but it still didn't work. We got a notice. Well, what sucked is I actually flew out to Cambridge in England for 6 weeks for that work with Cambridge. I had handled it. I met with the officer. I showed them my stuff. They said everything was good. I fly out. 11 days later, while I'm gone, we get a notice saying the township has requested that all your reptiles, except the 3-foot rat snake, go figure, all the reptiles except the 3-foot rat snake must be removed within 7 days or they will be confiscated and euthanized. And so from England, I had to direct my husband and my friends to like pack up and move all my reptiles, which is hilarious because it was a little township, like barely like 2 square miles. They moved everything to my cousin's house, literally a mile down the road, because she had potbelly pig. She was in a different township. It was like 6 blocks away. It was so close. And she had a big basement, and we just put everything there for the summer until we moved to our new house, because we were like living with her while we bought our house. So it was just like this weird time period. But she had potbelly pigs and a raccoon and a bunch of other stuff. So she was like, bring it on in. I don't get in trouble. My neighbors love me. So yeah. That was my only experience, but I'll never forget that. And right away, my brain was just like under 6 feet, knowing that law. But I think that's one of those things is like the laws are inconsistent. They're poorly enforced. And then, everybody knew I was a scientist and a teacher and, you just have a bad neighbor. And, unfortunately, like that's all that takes. But, I learned a lot from that, and I will say that it can happen to the best of us, So my cages, I definitely don't, let them play out in open screen porches like that again. But that, that's the thing about tegus and monitors. They're always keeping you guessing. They're very smart. The second you turn down your gaze or your attention, they're on you. They're taking advantage of it.
Yeah. Speaking of their intelligence, you want to talk about tegu intelligence for a little bit?
Yeah, so tegus are really, they haven't had much done in studies. It's another thing I'd love to spend more time on. Really is, getting to assess their level of cognition. But they have been shown in some comparable studies of monitors in prior studies, and somewhat old literature. I think the last one I saw was like 2012 was probably the most recent, where they're looking at cognition, identifying colors and shapes to get on mazes. But with me, I clicker train them. I've done some videos of this on social media with like actually how I train them. I actually, my adult male, I can hold up a food item and actually say open, and he'll actually open and hold his mouth and wait for it to be dropped in. And I started with tongue feeding and clicker feeding and stuff, and just, even with coming to the front of the cage, I can pat and call his name. He'll actually come to the front of the cage, and I've noticed too that like just they do like, like they're like a bird. I always say working with monitors and tegus is more like working with a parrot. They like to hear you talk. They like to, like I talk to them before I touch them and let them know I'm coming into the cage. And they're very, very smart. It's so much like working with the velociraptors from Jurassic Park or something. Like being Owen, because they really are very smart, and it's all in that eye. So similar to working with birds, it's not just the intelligence. You see a lot in the eye, the facial expression. So when you work with a bird, they do something called a pinning behavior, where their pupil will go really, excuse me, their pupil will go really big to really small rapidly. And that's the brain processing and thinking. But if it shrinks and stays there, it's about to bite you. So that's what you learn working with parrots. But tegus are very similar. It's the tilt of the head, the angle, the way they look at you.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, they like tilt their head a little bit and they kind of look up at you, and it's almost like they're like saying F you a little bit. Like they have this like look in their eye, and like you can always tell they're about to bite you or tail whip you because they have that facial expression, but like their eye just says a lot, and the way they blink and like slow pause to open their eyes. Like it's just these little subtle things. But I'm just a big believer that every animal uses body language, and if you don't see it, you just haven't spent enough time with them. But I think the craziest thing I can tell you about tegu behavior is what I kind of just touched on, is the escape behavior. That anyone I've talked to, like breeding farms, the facilities, the trapper, when they've had them get loose out of a cage, or it happens, and I would say 90% of the time when they do get loose, they're able to use a trap and catch them, because tegus will stay around other tegus. And what's crazy is when you have a breeding farm, like the trapper, he's in Homestead, he's trapping them and putting them in and reselling them into the pet trade, mostly, now all out of the country. As like apartment pets in Asia, they're actually pretty common and very popular there. But when he has them in a breeding, in like a like a holding area, they're like 30 by 50 pens, and if they get out, he can trap them and stuff. But he said wild tegus will come hang out. So tegus he hasn't trapped that live in the area are attracted by the food and the noise of their own species, and so he'll trap regularly around there. But he did tell me a story once where, because he told me, once one gets out, they all get out, like it's like very, very quick. And I've experienced that. I've heard that from other people. But what I wasn't prepared for, and I wish he would have gotten a video, and I've phoned for years to get a video of this, is they cooperate. So there's some kind of communication happening where they can escape that quickly. Once one finds an exit, they all get out. But what he said he observed one day is they were cooperating. They actually lined up. So there was a tegu digging a hole at the edge of an enclosure, an outdoor enclosure that with like uses a lot of like old big, I think like big like agricultural bins, like so they're open, like, or he builds them with like wooden planks, so they're like like a good 6 feet, 8 feet high, and it's like a 30 by 50 pen, but it's a dirt ground, and so this thing's digging, and he said he watched as they lined up 3 and 4 behind him, like they're waiting in line at the grocery store. And then when one got tired of digging, it would move, and the next went up and just kept digging, so that there was always a tegu digging at the spot that they had sensed was the weakest, and they were cooperating in a wait line. So I trust the eyewitness to the end of the world, but I don't have video footage of this.
I mean, they already had the black and white stripes mixed for a perfect prison escape movie.
The Hamburglar, the chicken burglar or something. They got the new Yeah, the tegu burglar, he eats not hamburgers, but everything meat. So it's weird, but I think that both tegus and monitors, smarter than cats and dogs, rival the upper level parrots. I think we have a lot of work to do to break that down, but I would argue tegus have more personality than monitors, but I'm sure that's fighting words for somebody.
Yeah. I was going to say that whole head tilting, one eye cocked on you behavior. I had noticed that with I don't notice that with the tegu I used to have. But also noticed it with my juvenile rhino iguana as well, especially when
Yeah.
I'm working around inside my enclosure, and he's like, "You have food this time? Have you brought me food?" So,
Yeah, they
but
definitely have
another
different
story,
looks.
yeah, another story was when I was working at the Serpentarium for Dr. Chris Carmichael. We had this big Asian water monitor there named Buddy,
Oh.
and be, because we want to give him as much enrichment as possible. Whenever we were there to supervise him, we would open up his cage and let him just walk out and explore around the Serpentarium. The thing was, as soon as we got on that carpet for like 1 or 2 minutes, he'll be on that carpet. And then he's like, okay, I guess I'm going to use the restroom now on the carpet. And I swear, every time he did that, he would look over his shoulder at me. I'd be like, buddy, no, don't do it. And he'd just look me straight in the eye as he plopped all over the carpet.
That is so funny. That is really funny. It almost like reminds me of like I don't know, just like a lot of birds will do that, like almost like hate pooping, like like Targi, like I work
He
with
loved me, so I don't know.
owls do this. I work at a rescue with owls, burrowing owls are one of my side projects that I've been doing for like 6 years. But when you volunteer at an owl rescue, barn owls will purposely fly at you, like by you, to crap on you. They do that yeah, it's ridiculous. It's like, I'm just trying to clean your cage and help you. Poop bombing. Yeah, no, they do that. So I wouldn't. And the owls are one of the dumbest. I mean, you get when 2/3 of your head's filled with eyeball. There's not much room for anything else. So and that's not an intelligent animal. So I do think spite exists among lower intelligence too. But when you're smart, it's like they're like, you're not going to do anything. You're going to clean this up, human. It's so funny.
I mean, he had shown no other signs of hating me whenever I picked him up or took him outside and walks and stuff like that. So
that's funny. And I think they just it's just a very I don't care attitude, like, no, they're funny. There's so much you can tell. And it's just, it's all in that eye, if people just looked at the eye, we're so used to things getting facial expressions. But I think it's funny. There was a study that came out just this last year that showed that domestic dogs have evolved additional facial muscles. Yeah. So they can better mimic our facial expressions, and a lot of dogs, I mean, even my bloodhound does the smile, where like they mimic your smile and it looks like they're baring their teeth, they're smiling. So I think that's so funny. I don't know if you've seen that one. There was a panda bear too. There was a panda bear who's, oh my gosh, it's like one of my favorite videos. You have to Google this. There was a panda bear who was taught, it was abandoned as an orphan, and it was taught how to break bamboo, because the adults teach them to break the bamboo and then they eat it. But since a human raised him and he had to break the bamboo, and the bamboo is very hard to break, he would like wince like this as he like bare his teeth and wince as he broke the bamboo. So the panda does that. It literally bares its teeth and winces every time it breaks the bamboo. And then the really funny part is sometimes it forgets to do it and it does it afterwards. It like breaks and goes, oh, smile. You gotta go. It is the funniest thing ever. But I think it's just really interesting that we can, relate with animals in a way. There's that mimicry, and I imagine my tegus mimic something about my behavior at that level. But I think it's just animal behavior is fascinating. It's so cool.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of blanking on questions at the moment. So, do you want to talk about anything else before we wrap up?
Yeah, I was gonna say, one of the things I'm really excited about right now that I would like to share, but beyond the tegu stuff, is really about my burrowing owl and horn lizard stuff. So a lot of what I'm working on now has been burrowing owls for the last 5 or 6 years, and we're finishing up our first study, and we're basically looking at these little burrowing owls. They breed and breed and live in burrows in the ground, but they can't create them themselves. They rely on outwash or burrowing animals or human construction errors like cracked sidewalks and stuff. So we're studying them between urban and rural environments in a lot of settings, and whether they're created naturally by animals or outwash versus artificial, where we actually have a rescue who's actually installing like Home Depot buckets with irrigation tubing. It's actually like buried in the ground, and then you relocate them. So we're studying transrelocated owls in different scenarios. And what's really exciting is a year ago we actually found, because one of the biggest arguments for these is, even though they work really good for the owls, arguably over they've installed 20,000 with 5,000 owls over the last 30 years in Arizona alone. a little bit New Mexico, a little California, a little Colorado. They're very beneficial, but the argument is, okay, well, they're not, natural and other animals can't use them. And so we've shown that they don't break down and they're very stable compared to natural burrows. But, the argument of other animals using them, but we've documented gopher tortoises, bull snakes, coach whips, a whole variety of rodents and dung beetles all using these burrows. But what was really exciting last year, just north of Tucson, we actually documented a regal, adult, healthy, very fat, regal horned lizard overwintering in the entrance of an artificial owl burrow. So that was something that I'm really excited about. That's coming out as a natural history note that I'm putting together. And I'm really excited to kind of bridge a few gaps. Like one of my biggest arguments, I think, as an ecologist is that we started by being naturalists, like Darwin. We studied everything. And now we've hyper focused on these little categories and we're not connecting. Like every herpetologist should have should have an interest in ecology, conservation, and environmental, because that's how we save and protect the species we love, and if you love them, you should want them to be in the wild. You should want, them to be healthy, whether they're in zoos, wild, or both, and I think zoos and hobbyists are some of our biggest resources. Most reptiles and birds and other animals are bred for the first time by hobbyists, not by zoos. And there's a lot of funny memes online about that, but we have to be as responsible and well run as the zoos too. So I'm excited to help better bridge those things, so by, connecting with the horned lizard people, connecting with people who study other creatures that live in burrows, like the prairie dogs and the black-footed ferrets out here on the West Coast that are critically endangered. So there's a really, I think, a good opportunity in the future to really just, study. Like, I want to be a naturalist. I want to study a lot of different things and connect people so that we can save things, because nothing exists in nature alone. That was from Silent Spring, right? Nothing in nature exists alone or can exist by itself. And another quote I always loved is, I forget who said this one, but it was, to say that any part of an ecosystem shouldn't be there or is insignificant is to misunderstand the complexity of the system that you attempt to disassemble. Right. And so I think that if we better collaborate, whether it's protections or research or, even things like, I think podcasts like this are just fabulous. I love what you're doing. So thank you. Keep doing it, because it's all about getting people talking about these issues and connecting. And if we can, we can learn, hey, this one, where poisonous versus venomous has has some legitimacy, and free handling is stupid. Like we can, like, those are important things that people need to hear. Like there's reasons for that, and it all boils back to a more connected community that holds each other responsible. So I think that's what I'd like to end on is I'd like to see herpers working more with birders and fishers and bug lovers, and having us all be a little bit more of a naturalist so we can better understand these ecosystems. I mean, copperheads love cicadas, coach whips hunt birds, and I mean, I don't know if you followed Emily Taylor's awesome live rattle cam in the last few months, but oh my goodness, like she's got pregnant mommy garter snakes cuddling with pregnant rattlesnakes and showing cooperative denning between different species. Like, I mean, the stuff that we can learn with a little more observation and a little more patience, it's exciting. And I like to say, I like to think that's where the pet trade is going, by having more education and using social media for the good.
Yeah. I was going to say about those artificial burrows, it's a hole in the ground of the desert. Of course, other animals are going to use it.
And they're like, oh, it's artificial, it doesn't last. It's like, well, plastic's pretty long-term durable compared to what else was there? Dirt? In the desert, like one flash flood, it's done. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, if anything, we have a kind of a problem with plastic lasting too long, so.
Exactly. And that's what plastic was invented to purposely not break down. It was corporations who chose to take that science and make it disposable. Exactly. It's got to be used for the right reasons. But the people who are arguing that, it's tough. The East Coast, when you look at Fish and Wildlife and DNR, a lot of these organizations on the East Coast, there a lot of people with science degrees, but they don't have money. I call them the Eeyore Brigade. Okay. And that's like Fish and Wildlife in Florida too. It's, we really want to try and we do our best, but we don't have a lot of money. It's like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, where he's always losing his tail and his little sad house falls down. And then on the West Coast, it's the good old boys. We don't have science. Our daddies are farmers, and we make decisions like like loosely from our belt. Pew, pew, good old boys. And that's the West Coast. And that's hilarious because that's California. People talk about California being so environmental. It's from a energy, pollution, trash side. Their conservation is garbage. And that comes from working with people who live there and work there. And I love California. I want to help them. But the conservation government programs are garbage. The scientists are awesome. but the conservation initiatives and what's being done, it's a lot of talk and not a lot of good stuff. So they're the ones, because they have ties with landowners, and the burrowing owl is basically overprotected in California. It's so protected that landowners and farmers don't want to work with it. Get it off my property. It's endangered. ESA, get it away from me, right? It's evil. ESA is bad. We want to take it down because we're on one political party side. We can't see between the two. And so you have that issue. And then at the same time, you have in Arizona and New Mexico where it's barely protected at all. The burrowing owl really isn't protected. It should be. I mean, they're down 97% nationwide for their populations. They should be an endangered species in every state that they occur in. Good news is their populations are untouched in Mexico, which is, I mean, pristine almost. Original populations for them, as well as other owls. And that's where the females go there to get fat every winter and then come back to breed in the spring and summer. Males stay in Arizona or wherever they are all year round. The only non-migratory ones are the ones found in Florida. So they all do that. And so, the biggest problem is that you have these ones that are not protected. So in Arizona, New Mexico, it's easy to find people to work with you, install the burrows, get it working. But urbanization is happening so quickly, we don't have laws to like make it stay there. Like once it's installed on your property, you can't touch it and move it. Like, so there isn't, and then it's hard to find new locations. But the biggest issue is right now, our research is trying to show that artificial burrows work. Transrelocation works. There's like nothing on artificial burrows, like maybe like 3 papers, maybe 6 on transrelocation that have ever been done. And most say it's controversial. It's not. It's because of the controversy of the West Coast just claiming it is. And they've even supported and put out bad science on it. The last thing on transrelocation artificial burrows that came out not even a year and a half ago was from these people of the bad science. And they basically said, we couldn't tell. Because the other option I should mention is putting a one-way door on their burrow. So when they exit, they just can't get back in. And they don't study where they go. But in this study, they did. And they studied both. They said, we're not sure. They both weren't that good. But I mean, when I'm studying burrows that have been installed for 30 years, 20,000 of them, 5,000, 6,000 owls. Every burrow I study has owls. And 90% of those owls don't have leg bands. That means they were born there, or they chose to choose that spot versus a wild burrow. And we're actually comparing sites that have artificial and natural burrows at the same site. And the best thing is a combination of both. But you're talking some farms have 90 and some or it might be a community college or a high school that has 5, but they use them and they work. And it's a frustrating methodology, but this is why invasive species is nothing but politics and loopholes. And research is great, but it's not enough. That's why that's why we know each other from social media, right? That's why I'm such a big advocate on social media for education and networking and outreach. And, that's how we connect these things and these issues, and get people to be aware of it. And that's how we address conservation. But it always takes a 5-headed dragon, never just a 1-headed dragon to solve issues. And invasive species is like a alien dragon with a head coming out of its butt too. So it's like, I don't even know how to solve that one, but little steps in the right direction. But I think the biggest key with any environmental issue is prevention, because often identifying or solving one creates 3 more, like what we're seeing with wind turbines killing birds and bats. And everything has a downside. It doesn't mean we should throw it away. It means we need to improve it. And we really should have studied it better at the front end, and we didn't.
Yeah. Well, with that, do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, I would just say that thank you so much for having me. I love being here, and I really appreciate what you're doing, and just, keep it up. We need more herpetology podcasts, and I'm just so thankful that I can be a part of it. So thank you so much, Nate. Thanks for having me today.
It's my pleasure.